Okay, welcome back. Just one more thing that we really want to cover in the whole information enigma area. Now that we have talked about the likelihood of forming a protein by chance, a protein of modest length, let us put this in perspective. And to do that, let me again go back to Stephen Meyer. Remember, we had followed his calculation that the odds of forming a modest length protein, one single functional protein of 150 amino acids, was 1 in 10 to the 164. So let us see what he says about this. It is impossible to convey what this number represents, but let me try. With the odds standing at one chance in 10 to the 164 of finding a functional protein among the possible 150 amino acid compounds, the probability is 84 orders of magnitude or powers of 10 smaller than the probability of finding the marked particle, meaning any sort of marked particle, in the whole universe. So what he's trying to say here is if you were to pick one specific subatomic particle, a neutron, a proton, in the entire universe, and you're hoping to find that by chance from sampling all of the particles in the universe, the likelihood of you doing that is 84 orders of magnitude bigger than by chance building a functional protein of 150 amino acids, which once again is a relatively small protein compared to many that the body uses. So now let's continue with the bolded section. Another way to say that is the probability of finding a functional protein by chance alone is a trillion, 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 trillion times smaller than the odds of finding a single specified particle among all the particles in the universe. So I think that this should entirely close the door on the notion of chance through so-called prebiotic evolution by just sheer luck building up either functional proteins or meaningful DNA sequences. However, there's one more area just to be really complete that we should cover in this topic, because wildly improbable things do sometimes happen. Not as improbable as this, but for example, someone buys a winning lottery ticket. For example, someone gets struck by lightning. So how is it that these improbable things happen? Well, they happen because a lot of people buy lottery tickets, so someone is then likely to win. If only a couple of people bought lottery tickets, then it would be highly unlikely. A lot of people in the world and a lot of thunderstorms and a lot of lightning strikes, so chances then become that someone somewhere may get struck by lightning. So could this same argument be applied to the primordial oceans filled with amino acids? Could some compound somewhere have formed a functional protein? Well, we've already seen really that no, because the chances exceed by far the total number of particles in the entire universe. But let's be complete and talk about the so-called computational capacity of the universe, or another way to put it is the probabilistic resources of the universe. What does that mean? Well, let me begin by a simple example. Let's say you walk into my office and see me flipping a coin, and I tell you that I just flipped 10 heads in a row. Well, you'll probably be skeptical because if you do the math, the likelihood of doing that is a little less than 1 in 1,000. It's 1 in 1,024. So it would be kind of funny if I just started flipping coins and flipped 10 heads in a row. So I see you raise an eyebrow that you're skeptical, and I tell you, I have been flipping coins all day. I've been standing here and flipping coins all day, and I just flipped 10 heads in a row. At this point, it's not so unreasonable. Why? Because I didn't just do one flip of 10 coins to try to get 10 heads in a row. I have been flipping coins over and over and over, so I brought enough probabilistic resources to bear to make an unlikely event likely. So it turns out that several very highly respected scientists have calculated the probabilistic resources of the entire universe. What does that mean? Well, the visible universe, at least, is finite. And quantum mechanics tells us that there is a minimum time in which events can happen, and there are a finite number of particles in the visible universe. Putting all of that together means that even though it may be an extremely large number, there is a finite number of possible events that the universe could have had since its beginning. And there's a very interesting quantum physics paper published in Physical Review Letters, which is an extremely prestigious physics journal, published by Seth Lloyd, who is professor of physics at MIT with a particular interest in quantum computing, complexity, and information theory. And he undertook the calculations, and according to his calculations, the universe has a maximum upper bound of having processed 10 to the 120 bits of information, or having performed 10 to the 120 operations on 10 to the 90 bits. So that gives you an upper bound on the sort of computational resources of the universe, a total of 10 to the 120 separate events. Now, I figure this is probably not a topic most of us have ever thought about, is the computational capacity of the universe. But as I said, there have been multiple estimates. I didn't put an estimate up here due to a French mathematician named Émile Borel earlier in the 20th century, where he estimated that it was 10 to the 50. Seth Lloyd estimates that it is 10 to the 120. William Dembski, who we've run into before, mathematician and a proponent of intelligent design, unlike Seth Lloyd, by the way, his estimate was 10 to the 150. There's a Wikipedia article on it if you're interested in how he arrived at that estimate, and he in fact pads that estimate by roughly an additional power of 10. His true estimate is closer to 10 to the 140, but just to be safe, he brings it up to 10 to the 150. That's 10, that's 1 followed by 150 zeros. That is the upper limit of physical events that could have occurred in the observable universe since its beginning in the Big Bang. So you see that the estimates are in this range. What does this tell us? Well, if the chances of forming one single protein are 1 in 10 to the 164, that means that if we take Dembski's estimate, Dembski's padded estimate of 10 to the 150, that, by the way, gives chance its best chance, because the more events that could have happened in the universe, the more probabilistic resources you bring to bear on a problem. It's like the more coin flips I did to get 10 heads in a row. So Dembski's estimate is the most generous to the chance hypothesis. But even with that upper bound estimate, let alone the estimates of Emile Borel or Seth Lloyd, if I could have had maximum of 10 to the 150 events, but the chances of forming one functional protein are 1 in 10 to the 164, it means that my chances of success, if the entire resources of the entire universe since its birth were devoted to trying to form one functional protein, if that were the case, which is of course ridiculous, the chances are roughly 1 in 100 trillion that this would have succeeded. They're less than that, in fact. So that hopefully would then put things in perspective. Somebody would say, well, yes, wildly improbable things happen, but if you compare how wildly improbable this is compared to the computational resources of the entire universe, now this should be an essentially complete proof that the chance hypothesis is impossible. And remember, all of this we have been talking about forming just one modest length functional protein. But if we look at a minimally complex cell, scientists that study this issue figure that the most primitive, most simple cell would need at least 250 proteins to be able to reproduce and survive. So the amount of information that DNA carried for primitive life to allow primitive life forms to exist and reproduce would have needed not just one protein, but 250 proteins, roughly. And so if the odds of forming one functional protein are 1 in 10 to the 164, the odds of, by chance, forming a living reproducing cell would be on the order of 1 in 10 to the 41,000. That completely dwarfs the computational resources of the entire universe. So if one protein was way beyond the computational resources of the entire universe, imagine all of the proteins to form one cell, living cell, or conversely, the mirror image of that, the information that had to be stored in DNA to make that happen. Now, different authors approach this with different methodologies. And you may say, well, Stephen Meyer is a proponent of intelligent design, so he's biased, etc. I don't find his science biased in the least. But let's go to Fred Hoyle. Again, we've talked about Fred Hoyle. May have mentioned him, and we will run into him again. But he is a professor of theoretical astrophysics, or was professor of theoretical astrophysics at Cambridge University. And he did the calculation for a human cell, assuming a much larger number of proteins that a human needed than a primitive cell. His calculations were different than Stephen Meyer, but the figure he arrives at is that the odds of producing those proteins for one functional cell in a higher level organism is about 1 in 10 to the 40,000. So really quite similar to Stephen Meyer's estimate, and once again really showing us the order of magnitude of the problem, the utter complexity of the information that DNA carries to make life possible, and how it is entirely impossible for this to have arisen by chance. I know that the numbers are way beyond any of our capacities to comprehend. Once we start getting beyond a billion, a trillion, etc., even a Google 10 to the 100. We can't really understand what that number means, let alone something like 10 to the 40,000. But I think we can understand the conclusions, and let's go back to Fred Hoyle's quotes once again, that despite this, the entire structure of orthodox biology still holds that life arose at random. Yet as biologists learn more and more about the awesome complexity of life, it is apparent that the chances of it originating by accident are so minute that they can be completely ruled out. Life cannot have arisen by chance. And then in a later chapter of the same book, he says that at some stage, the genesis of information must be explained. This, as we saw in the previous chapter, is essentially impossible within the biological system itself. Only if the genetic information comes from outside the system, from somewhere else altogether, can evolution per saltum be explained. So, if this is the situation, how is it that so many scientists still cling to the materialist perspective that what we see does not need an intelligent designer? To be honest with you, I have no explanation. We have covered this quote before, but it is so profound to me and really so true. And so unique, because I've only seen one person admit it. But this is the only explanation I have. And again, this was said by George Wald, Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine in 1967. And it gives what I think is really the best explanation, the most plausible explanation, why in the face of the things we've covered, people still will not believe in intelligent design. And he said, talking about the chance hypothesis, and then talking about intelligent design and the belief in God who designed this system, I will not believe that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible. Spontaneous generation arising to evolution. Spontaneous generation means the chance production of life, the chance generation of life, arising then to Darwinian evolution. And I can't think of any other explanation given what we've covered. I hope that you're enjoying the lecture series so far. There is more to come.